November 26, 1943, 11:47 a.m. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring stood before a wall-sized map of Europe, colored pins marking Luftwaffe bases, red arrows indicating Allied bomber routes. In his hands, a leather-bound intelligence report stamped Streng Geheim, Top Secret. The document, compiled by Luftwaffe Intelligence Chief Joseph Schmidt, contained combat assessments, technical specifications, and pilot testimonies about a single aircraft type, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Adolf Hitler entered the conference room at precisely noon, his routine unchanged despite mounting military disasters on every front. Göring, once the jovial Iron Man who had promised no Allied bomber would ever reach Berlin, now appeared diminished. His ornate Luftwaffe uniform, draped with medals from another war, seemed a costume from a vanished era. He opened the report and began reading statistics that would confirm what Hitler had suspected but refused to acknowledge, that the war was already lost. The numbers were brutal. In the 6 months since P-47s began operating over occupied Europe, Luftwaffe fighter losses had tripled. Pilot casualties exceeded replacement training capacity by a factor of 5. German fighter production, despite frantic efforts to increase output, couldn't match the rate at which Thunderbolts were destroying them. Most damning, American bomber formations, once vulnerable targets suffering catastrophic losses, now reached their targets with regularity. The escort fighters Hitler had dismissed as flying milk bottles were systematically annihilating the fighter force Germany had spent a decade building. Hitler's response, according to stenographers present, was silence. Not the explosive rage that characterized his reaction to most bad news, not the delusional optimism that allowed him to dismiss reality when convenient. Just silence. The recognition, momentary but unmistakable, that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical brilliance, that American factories could produce what German ingenuity could not counter, that the Reich's defeat was now a matter of mathematics, not willpower. This is the story of how one aircraft type, ugly, heavy, seemingly unsuited for air combat, destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace. How American industrial philosophy, applied to fighter design, created a weapon that German pilots feared more than any other Allied aircraft. How the transformation from mockery to terror took less than 18 months. And how Adolf Hitler, seeing the evidence compiled by his own intelligence services, understood that the war was already over, though 2 years of slaughter remained before final surrender. The P-47 Thunderbolt that would shatter Hitler's delusions began as a panic response to German success. In June 1940, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, watched newsreels of Luftwaffe fighters dominating European skies. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s destroyed Polish, French, and British aircraft with systematic efficiency. The fighters Germany had developed during the 1930s, theoretically illegal under Versailles Treaty restrictions, but secretly funded by the Nazi regime, had proven superior to anything European democracies could field. The American Army Air Corps, studying the same combat reports, recognized that America's existing fighters were obsolete before they entered production. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk, the primary American fighter in 1940, was outclassed by German and Japanese designs. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, with its mid-mounted engine and tricycle landing gear, offered an innovative design but mediocre performance. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning showed promise but remained in development. America needed a fighter that could match the Luftwaffe's best at altitude, where bomber formations operated. Kartvel's response was radical. Rather than pursuing the lightweight, agile fighter philosophy that dominated European design, he designed around raw power. The largest radial engine available, Pratt & Whitney's R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder monster producing 2,000 horsepower. A turbo-supercharger system that maintained sea-level performance at stratospheric altitudes. Armor protection that treated pilot survivability as paramount, and armament that emphasized sustained firepower over surgical precision. 8 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. The XP-47B prototype that first flew on May 6, 1941, shocked observers. At 9,900 pounds empty, it weighed 65% more than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The enormous radial engine, enclosed in the cowling that gave the aircraft a barrel-chested appearance, seemed disproportionate to the relatively small wings. The massive four-bladed propeller, 13 feet in diameter, dwarfed anything in American or European inventory. Test pilots approaching it for the first time invariably asked the same question: "This thing actually flies?" Not only did it fly, it dominated at altitude in ways no other fighter could match. The R2800 engine, supercharged by exhaust-driven turbines, maintained full power output at 27,000 feet, where German fighters struggled for oxygen. The massive propeller, initially criticized as excessive, bit into thin air with authority that converted engine power to thrust efficiently. At 30,000 feet, where German fighters struggled, the P-47 accelerated like it was falling upward. But the Army Air Force's procurement process moved slowly. Design refinements consumed months. Production tooling required factory construction. Pilot training demanded new facilities. By the time operational P-47Cs began arriving in England in late 1942, the Luftwaffe had been fighting continuously for 3 years. German pilots were veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. They had developed tactics, refined techniques, and accumulated combat experience impossible to replicate in peacetime training. The Germans' first encounters with P-47s in April 1943 confirmed every prejudice about American engineering. The Thunderbolts were enormous. Fat became the universal descriptor. They couldn't turn with Bf-109s. They couldn't climb with FW-190s. At medium altitudes, where most air combat occurred, they seemed slow and ungainly. Luftwaffe pilots quickly developed tactics exploiting these weaknesses, attacking from below where the heavy Americans struggled, forcing turning fights where agility mattered more than power. Hauptmann Josef Pips Prehler, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26 and one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, reported to headquarters after his first engagement with P-47s. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys are calling them Indianer, fat targets pretending to be warriors." The statistics from April and May 1943 seemed to validate German confidence. American fighter groups equipped with P-47s lost 14 Thunderbolts in their first month of operations for only 3 confirmed German kills. The loss ratio favored the Luftwaffe by nearly 5 to 1. The Royal Air Force, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans reconsider their choice of mount. British pilots joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the roomy cockpit. What the Germans failed to notice, what their intelligence services initially dismissed as anomalous data, was that P-47s were absorbing damage that would have destroyed any other fighter. Aircraft returned from missions with 20, 30, or 50 cannon shell hits. Damage that would have shredded a Bf-109's liquid-cooled engine merely pockmarked the P-47's massive radial engine. Hits that would have severed a FW-190's control cables were absorbed by redundant systems. The Thunderbolt's structural strength, initially dismissed as unnecessary weight, proved to be a decisive advantage. More significantly, when P-47s did get their guns on target, the results were catastrophic. The 8-gun battery, converging at 300 yards, created a zone of destruction unlike anything Luftwaffe pilots had experienced. A 2-second burst delivered 16 half-inch projectiles, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second, each capable of penetrating armor plate, each loaded with an incendiary compound that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The transformation of German perception began on June 26, 1943, with an incident that would become legendary on both sides of the conflict. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron was returning from escort duty when his P-47 was caught by 16 FW-190s from 2/JG-26. The Germans executed a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage. Johnson's Thunderbolt took catastrophic damage in the first seconds. 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit. The engine cowling was torn away. Fire erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson, wounded by shrapnel and unable to bail out due to a jammed canopy, somehow leveled the aircraft and pointed it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that should have reduced it to falling debris. Then a lone FW-190, discovering the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the channel, positioned for the kill. The German pilot, never definitively identified, emptied his entire ammunition load into Johnson's aircraft. 4 20mm cannon and 2 13mm machine guns fired at point-blank range poured destruction into the P-47. Still, it flew. The German pilot pulled alongside, staring in disbelief at the flying wreck. Johnson could see his face clearly through the oil-covered windscreen. Young, blonde, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear. The German gave an informal salute and peeled away, out of ammunition. Johnson's P-47 landed at Manston with its engine failing on the runway. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot through. Yet the aircraft had brought him home. The survival of Johnson's Thunderbolt sent shockwaves through Luftwaffe intelligence. The combat report from 2/JG-26, confirmed by multiple pilots, described an impossible event. No aircraft could absorb that much punishment. German fighters, optimized for performance through weight reduction, used minimal structural margins. A dozen hits from 50 caliber guns would typically prove fatal. Johnson's P-47 had taken over 200 hits, including direct cannon strikes, and survived. By July 1943, American pilots were learning to exploit the P-47's true advantages. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, discovered the secret through brutal trial and error. Don't turn with them, don't climb with them at low altitude. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially seen as a disadvantage, became a weapon. In a dive, nothing could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve even in vertical dives. This speed could be converted to altitude in zoom climbs that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind. Captain Walker Bud Mahiran, who would become one of America's first aces in Europe, developed what became known as boom and zoom tactics. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfights, P-47 formations climbed to 30,000 feet, higher than German fighters could effectively operate. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dove, reaching speeds that made defensive maneuvering impossible. At the bottom of these dives, the American heavy machine guns spoke. German pilots who survived described facing a wall of lead, concentrated firepower creating an impenetrable zone of destruction. The true revelation of American firepower came during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt Me-110 destroyer aircraft positioning to attack B-17s with heavy cannon and rockets. The twin-engined German fighters, heavily armed but less maneuverable, were the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber killers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Me-110s who survived, later recounted in a POW interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I opened fire at 800 meters. Good hits. I saw them strike the fighter's wing. The P-47 didn't even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us simply came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage. Tails severed, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In 2 seconds, a 110 became nothing. 8 Me-110s were destroyed in less than a minute. The German pilots had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds total, weighing nearly 900 pounds. At convergence distance, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything in that zone faced 100 projectiles per second, each capable of penetrating armor, each loaded with an incendiary compound designed to ignite aluminum structure. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about the P-47. Its performance improved dramatically with altitude while German fighters suffered. The turbo-supercharged R-2800 engine maintained rated power output to 30,000 feet. German fighters, relying on mechanical superchargers, saw performance degrade significantly above 25,000 feet. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, encountered this reality fatally on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp found his FW-190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in thin air. The BMW 801 engine, powerful at medium altitudes, was gasping for oxygen nearly 6 miles above Earth. When P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were helpless. Robert Johnson, the same pilot who had survived the June 26th encounter, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf with its elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report was clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along the entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their best, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, couldn't survive against Thunderbolts, what chance did average pilots have? The German High Command ordered an immediate investigation into the P-47's capabilities. The report, delivered to Göring in November 1943, was sobering. Service ceiling, 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Dive speed, approaching 550 miles per hour, faster than any Luftwaffe fighter in any configuration. Armor, 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, 1/2-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, armored deflection plates around the engine. Structural strength, capable of absorbing damage that would destroy 3 conventional fighters. Armament, sustained firepower exceeding any German fighter by factors of 10. Most disturbingly, the report noted that P-47 production was accelerating. Republic Aviation's factories were producing Thunderbolts faster than the Luftwaffe could train replacement pilots. Each loss Germany suffered was increasingly irreplaceable. Each American loss was replaced within days. It was this report that Göring presented to Hitler on November 26, 1943. The Führer, who had built his political career on willpower overcoming material disadvantages, confronted evidence that industrial capacity determined modern warfare's outcome. The Reich could produce excellent fighters. The Bf-109G and Fw-190A were technically sophisticated, well-armed, and, in the hands of skilled pilots, deadly effective. But Germany couldn't produce them in sufficient quantities while simultaneously replacing experienced pilots at the rate the P-47s were killing them. Hitler's silence during that briefing reflected recognition of mathematics he couldn't escape. American factories produced 15,683 P-47s during the war. Germany produced approximately 34,000 Bf-109s of all variants and 20,000 Fw-190s. Impressive numbers when compared to total Allied production. America alone produced over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced approximately 119,000. The disparity wasn't merely numerical, it was qualitative. Each P-47 required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminium, and an engine containing 2,400 individual components machined to tolerances of 1,000th of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision exceeding peacetime standards. At peak production, Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed 1 P-47 every hour around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, produced 500 aircraft monthly by 1944. Each factory worker understood their role in a production system that transformed raw materials into combat aircraft, with efficiency that German industry, despite its reputation for engineering excellence, couldn't match. The ammunition production supporting P-47 operations was equally staggering. Each sortie required 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. With hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds monthly by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition plants, produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge was manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through synchronized gun mechanisms. Even fuel consumption demonstrated American industrial might. Each P-47 burned 100 gallons per hour in normal flight, up to 300 gallons in combat, with water injection engaged. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944, all shipped across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production. By January 1944, an upgraded P-47 variant began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from laughingstock to nightmare. The P-47 D-22 featured a hydraulic propeller with paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter, with broad chord blades that bit into the air like massive oars. The improvement in climb rate was immediate and dramatic. Where earlier Thunderbolts climbed at 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, paddle blade variants achieved 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters at most altitudes. Hauptmann Heinz Knoke of Jagdgestern 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He wrote in his combat diary, "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced a formation near Hanover, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed us up to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was caught and blown apart, nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year." The paddle blade propeller did more than improve performance. It changed the sound of the Thunderbolt. The distinctive thundering roar, created by blade tips reaching supersonic speeds, could be heard from miles away. German ground troops reported being able to identify approaching P-47s by sound alone, a deep threatening rumble that meant death from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into Germany. The standard configuration carried two 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending range to over 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when loaded, Thunderbolts could fight on equal terms immediately after dropping tanks. The Luftwaffe's response was to concentrate on bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to stop the American daylight campaign. But this required flying through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition. German pilots developed grudging respect that bordered on fear for the big American fighters. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's top aces, with over 275 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him badly wounded. He later recalled in a post-war interview, "We saw them above us, fat silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed and said, 'Here come the flying pigs.' Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later. They came down like an avalanche, faster than we could react. The first pass destroyed 3 of our fighters, just gone, transformed into burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They poured out solid streams of fire. Getting caught in that stream meant instant death." As P-51 Mustangs arrived to take over long-range escort duties in spring 1944, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets. Standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate the top armor of most German vehicles. A 2-second burst delivered 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that transformed the P-47 into a true multi-role monster. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pounder under the fuselage, a bomb load equal to early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The sound was terrifying. Engines roaring, rockets screaming, then the hammer of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply ceased to exist. 20 vehicles transformed into burning wreckage in one pass. The psychological effect on the men was devastating. They called them jabos, fighter bombers. But these were something beyond that. They were flying artillery with the accuracy of snipers. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion, creating an impenetrable umbrella over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were massacred. Oberlieutenant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day, reported, "The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn, 12 fighters from our Group A. I was the only one to return. The P-47s were waiting at every altitude. You couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." In the weeks following D-Day, P-47s systematically destroyed German movement in daylight. The statistics were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night, severely hampering their ability to respond to Allied advances. The Germans tried everything to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor, deployed more anti-aircraft guns, developed new camouflage techniques. Nothing worked. The P-47's combination of speed, armor, and firepower made it nearly unstoppable. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track fast-moving fighters at low altitude. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came in encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its 540 mph top speed, should have been untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. But Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in 2 situations: during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, and in high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down a Messerschmitt Me-262 with a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 mph, fast enough to catch the jet in level flight. The jet pilot, confident in his speed advantage, never saw the diving P-47 until Meyer's guns opened up at 400 yards. Meyer's combat report noted, "The enemy aircraft disintegrated under fire. Large pieces, including both engines, were separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. The concentrated fire of 850 caliber guns proved more effective than we anticipated against jet aircraft." By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting power to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 mph in level flight at 30,000 feet, fast enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might came during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially succeeded. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot, brought to the command post, pointed at the burning aircraft and taunted, "What do you think of that?" Major George Brookings' response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force. He pointed to the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing hard stands for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's smirk disappeared. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 D-40s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and squadron leaders, losses they could never replace. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, all replaced within a week. The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. Hitler, receiving reports of Bodenplatte's failure, finally acknowledged what he had understood since November 1943 but refused to admit publicly, that American industrial capacity made German defeat mathematically certain. The Luftwaffe could win individual battles, German pilots could achieve local air superiority, but every victory consumed resources Germany couldn't replace while American production accelerated. In March 1945, Hauptmann Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking to boost morale. His statement, deemed too demoralizing for publication, revealed the complete transformation in German attitudes. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unprecedented. Weapons that never jam, never overheat, never run out of ammunition in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and fights like a fighter when needed. But beyond the machine is what it represents: unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have nothing but courage. And courage without resources is just delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts us, mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it's about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't beat us through better tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded most aircraft, experienced pilots were dead or captured, airfields were cratered ruins. But even with aircraft and fuel, German pilots faced an impossible equation. Attacking meant facing P-47 formations that owned every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was hit by sledgehammers. The engine exploded and the wings separated. I barely escaped. In the parachute, I watched them destroy my entire Staffel. 6 fighters gone in under a minute. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact was complete. German pilots developed what medical officers called Yabo fever, physical symptoms of stress appearing when Thunderbolts were reported in the area. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops who knew survival meant finding cover immediately. The final statistics of P-47 operations defied comprehension. European theater: 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. Pacific Theater: 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, countless barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force, alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat, while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. Behind these numbers lay the human cost. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied forces. Many fell to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training Germany could never replace. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot had less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had over 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were debriefed by German intelligence. The records, captured in 1945, revealed German assessments of Allied aircraft. The file on the P-47, updated continuously throughout the war, showed a complete reversal of opinion. April 1943. Large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed. Machine gun armament is insufficient against cannon-armed fighters. Assessment: minimal threat. December 1943. Exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength. Firepower is increasingly problematic. Pilots are showing improved tactics. Assessment: significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against all target types. Structural strength makes shoot-down extremely difficult. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war. A combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality is exceptional. Assessment: unsurvivable in direct engagement. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former adversaries met in peace. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His response, recorded on video, captured the complete transformation. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. The Americans don't understand air combat, we said. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the plane that could take punishment and deliver devastating firepower would win. They were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was incredible. It climbed like it was falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable. The visibility is excellent. The controls are precise. It was a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor. But what really impressed me was realizing that America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting a two-ocean war. Each one required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced, yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. Those guns, we called them Roosevelt's Plunger because of the sound they made. Once you hear that sound, you never forget it. Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it destroyed it. The moment Hitler realized the war was lost, wasn't when Soviet armies crossed German borders. It wasn't when Allied forces landed in Normandy. It was November 26, 1943, in a conference room at the Berghof, reading intelligence reports about an ugly American fighter that couldn't turn, couldn't climb at low altitude, couldn't match German fighters in traditional dogfighting. But the P-47 didn't need to turn or climb or dogfight. It just needed to dive from 30,000 feet and open fire. In that moment, Hitler understood that tactical brilliance couldn't overcome industrial supremacy, that German engineering excellence couldn't counter American manufacturing capacity, that willpower and ideology couldn't stop 8 synchronized Browning machine guns delivering 100 rounds per second into fighter-sized targets. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat as an object of derision and ended the war as an instrument of annihilation. In between, it systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to defend German airspace, protect ground forces, or contest Allied air superiority. German pilots who laughed in April 1943 were dead by 1945. Those who survived spoke of Thunderbolts in hushed tones for the rest of their lives. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. Its placard lists specifications and battle honors, but the real story is told by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under fire. Below the display is a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them, fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb. They just pointed those guns at you and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with our comrades. Hitler saw the P-47 Thunderbolt through intelligence reports in November 1943. In that moment of silence, he understood what German propaganda would never admit publicly, that the Reich was already defeated. The remaining 18 months of war were merely mathematics playing out. American factories are producing, German pilots are dying. The thunder grew louder until nothing else could be heard. By May 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The sky belonged to America. The aftermath of Hitler's realization rippled through the German war machine in ways that remained classified for decades. Following the November 26th briefing, Hitler ordered an emergency conference of Reich industry leaders. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, received instructions to prioritize fighter production above all other military needs, tanks, submarines, even the V-weapon programs Hitler had championed. The directive came too late. German industry, already strained by strategic bombing and resource shortages, couldn't match American production scales. Speer's ministry performed miracles of improvisation, dispersing factories into forests, hiding production facilities in caves and tunnels, utilizing slave labor from concentration camps. Fighter production actually increased through 1944, reaching a peak monthly output of over 3,000 aircraft in September. But production meant nothing without pilots to fly them or fuel to power them. The Luftwaffe training pipeline, already stressed by losses, collapsed under the weight of exponential attrition. In 1943, German fighter pilot training required 6 months and produced marginally competent pilots. By 1944, training was compressed to 8 weeks. By 1945, some pilots entered combat with less than 30 hours total flight time, barely enough to take off and land safely, let alone survive against veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience. Lieutenant Heinz Sachsenberg, who survived the war despite flying operationally from March through May 1945, later described his training. "We had 3 weeks of basic flight instruction, 3 weeks of fighter training, 2 weeks of gunnery practice. No formation flying, no combat tactics, no instrument training. They gave us Bf-110 G-14 high-performance fighters with tricky handling characteristics and told us to intercept American bomber formations protected by hundreds of escort fighters. It was systematic murder. Of the 42 pilots in my training class, 3 survived the war. The fuel situation was equally catastrophic. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, targeted systematically by Allied bombing from May 1944 onward, saw production collapse from 316,000 tons in March 1944 to 17,000 by September. The Luftwaffe units were grounded not by lack of aircraft or pilots, but by lack of fuel. Fighters sat on airfields, pristine and fully armed, unable to launch because aviation gasoline didn't exist. When fuel was available, Luftwaffe formations launching to intercept bomber streams faced an impossible tactical equation. P-47s operated in layers, high cover at 32,000 feet, medium cover at 28,000 feet, close escort at bomber altitude around 25,000 feet. Any German formation attempting to reach bombers had to fight through multiple screens of Thunderbolts, each with altitude advantage, each able to dive and attack with overwhelming speed. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced commanders with 176 victories, described the hopelessness in his post-war memoir. By early 1945, launching a fighter mission against American bomber formations was tantamount to signing death warrants for half your pilots. The mathematics was brutal. To reach bombers, you had to climb through multiple fighter screens. Each screen would destroy 10 to 20% of your formation. By the time you reached bombers, if you reached them, your formation was shattered, your pilots exhausted, your fuel critical. Then, as you tried to disengage, the P-47s would follow you down, hunting stragglers. The psychological toll on surviving German pilots manifested in ways that Luftwaffe medical officers struggled to address. Combat fatigue, what modern psychiatry recognizes as post-traumatic stress disorder, became epidemic. Pilots who had flown hundreds of missions without hesitation suddenly froze before takeoff. Others experienced panic attacks in flight. Some simply refused to fly, accepting court-martial rather than face Thunderbolts again. Hauptmann Harman Graf, a Luftwaffe ace with 212 victories, mostly on the Eastern Front, was transferred to Western Front Command in January 1945. He flew 3 missions against American bomber formations before requesting transfer back to the East. His official report stated, "The tactical situation in the West differs fundamentally from the East. Soviet fighters are numerous, but individually less capable. American fighters are individually superior and operate in overwhelming numbers. The psychological effect on pilots is devastating. They know that launching means probable death." Hitler's response to mounting evidence of defeat was characteristic: denial combined with unrealistic faith in technological salvation. He fixated on jet fighters, particularly the Me-262, as potential war winners. If Germany could produce jets in sufficient numbers, he reasoned, the speed advantage would negate American numerical superiority. The reasoning was flawed. Jet production required resources Germany no longer possessed: specialized alloys, precision manufacturing, and skilled labor. Jets consumed fuel at rates that made them impractical given fuel shortages. Jet engines required maintenance after every few hours of operation, demanding infrastructure that didn't exist. Most fundamentally, jets still had to take off and land, moments when they were vulnerable to the very P-47s Hitler hoped to evade. Major Georg Peter Ader, who flew both Me-262s and conventional fighters operationally, described the reality. The 262 was faster than any Allied fighter in level flight, but speed means nothing if you can't employ it tactically. We had to take off from bases the Allies knew. P-47s would orbit nearby, waiting. As we accelerated down the runway, they would dive to attack. Our jets were vulnerable for the first minutes after takeoff while climbing to speed. Many pilots never reached altitude. Those who did found that attacking bombers required slowing to engagement speed, the moment P-47s waiting above would pounce. We called it the death dive, American fighters dropping from above while we were slow and vulnerable. The statistics confirmed Ader's assessment. Of approximately 1,400 Me-262s produced, only about 200 saw combat before the war's end. Of those, roughly 100 were lost to enemy action, many destroyed on takeoff or landing by conventional fighters, including P-47s. The jets that survived achieved modest success against bombers but couldn't contest Allied air superiority. One technological advantage couldn't overcome systematic disadvantages in numbers, training, fuel, and tactics. By March 1945, Hitler's public pronouncements about final victory and secret weapons had become disconnected from the reality that even Nazi propaganda officials recognized as delusional. The Führer, increasingly isolated in the Berlin bunker, received filtered reports that minimized German losses while exaggerating Allied casualties. But even sanitized intelligence couldn't hide the fundamental fact that Germany had lost control of its own airspace. American fighters, P-47s, P-51s, and P-38s, operated over Germany with impunity. They escorted bombers that destroyed whatever industrial capacity remained. They strafed trains, trucks, and troop concentrations. They interdicted supply lines. They made daytime movements suicidal for German forces. The Luftwaffe, once the most formidable air force in the world, had been reduced to ineffectual remnants scattered across a shrinking Reich. The final accounting was statistical and brutal. From January 1944 through May 1945, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 20,000 fighters on the Western Front. Pilot losses exceeded 15,000 killed, wounded, or captured. These losses were irreplaceable. Germany began the war with approximately 1,000 trained fighter pilots. Through 1943, training programs produced replacements roughly equal to losses. From 1944 onward, losses exceeded replacements by factors of 3 to 1, then 5 to 1, then 10 to 1. The Americans, by contrast, suffered losses they could absorb. The 8th and 9th Air Forces lost approximately 2,700 P-47s to all causes during the war: combat, accidents, and mechanical failures. Each loss was replaced within days. Pilots killed or captured were replaced by graduates from training programs producing thousands of aviators monthly. The disparity in resources created an attrition spiral that Germany couldn't escape. Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force from January 1944, understood the mathematics perfectly. In a classified briefing to Army Air Forces Commander General Henry Hap Arnold in March 1944, Doolittle stated, "We're not just destroying German fighters, we're destroying their ability to create fighter pilots. Every experienced pilot we kill represents years of training they can't replace. Every novice pilot we kill represents resources wasted on training that produced no operational value. We're not fighting the Luftwaffe of 1943, we're fighting the disintegrating remnants of an Air Force that lost its institutional knowledge." The institutional knowledge Doolittle referenced, accumulated experience, tactical refinements, technical expertise, had indeed evaporated. The Luftwaffe of 1940, which had swept across Europe with tactical brilliance, no longer existed. The veterans who had learned fighter tactics over Poland, perfected them over France, and refined them over Britain were mostly dead. Those who survived were exhausted, flying obsolete aircraft, outnumbered and demoralized. Oberst Walter Ossow, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated pilots with 127 victories, was killed by P-38s on May 11, 1944. Major Heinz Baer, with 220 victories, survived the war but described the final year as systematic extermination. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 victories, all on the Eastern Front, refused transfer to the West, recognizing it as suicide. Of the Luftwaffe's top 50 aces, 37 were killed in action. The survivors spoke of the war's final year with trauma that never healed. What Hitler realized in November 1943 and what German pilots discovered through 1944 and 1945 was that modern warfare rewarded industrial capacity more than individual skill. A mediocre American pilot in a P-47, supported by unlimited fuel and ammunition, backed by replacement aircraft and trained reserves, would defeat an excellent German pilot in a Bf-109 who flew with fuel for one mission, ammunition for one engagement, and no replacement if shot down. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied this industrial philosophy. It wasn't the most elegant fighter, it wasn't the fastest or most maneuverable, but it was durable, maintainable, producible, and deadly. Republic Aviation built 15,683 of them. Each one represented American manufacturing capacity that Germany, even at peak efficiency, couldn't approach. The true genius of the P-47 wasn't its design, it was the system that produced it. The Pratt & Whitney factories that built R-2800 engines, the Colt factories that manufactured M2 Browning machine guns, the ammunition plants that produced billions of .5 caliber rounds, the training programs that produced thousands of pilots, the logistics network that delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, the maintenance crews that kept aircraft operational, the entire industrial ecosystem that made American air power sustainable. Germany possessed excellent engineers who designed sophisticated fighters. Germany had brave pilots who flew them skillfully. Germany had factories that produced them efficiently, given resource constraints. But Germany couldn't create the systematic, industrial, massively redundant production capacity that America mobilized. When Hitler saw the intelligence reports on November 26, 1943, he understood this. For a brief moment, ideology yielded to mathematics. The silence that followed Göring's briefing reflected recognition that willpower couldn't overcome material reality, that Nazi socialism couldn't conjure resources from rhetoric, that Germany was fighting an opponent capable of replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The realization didn't change Hitler's public stance. He continued demanding final victory, promising secret weapons, and insisting that willpower would triumph. But privately, according to stenographers and staff officers present during final briefings, Hitler acknowledged defeat. Not in explicit terms. That would have been psychologically impossible for a man who built his identity on never surrendering. But in small admissions, in questions about the preservation of architectural monuments, in discussions of surrender terms he would never accept, in silences when aides suggested victory was still possible. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoir Inside the Third Reich, recounted a conversation with Hitler in March 1945. I told the Führer that the war was lost, that continuing meant needless destruction of Germany's industrial capacity and infrastructure. He listened silently, then said, I knew we would lose when I saw what American industry could produce, not in quantity alone but in the systematic application of resources. They built fighters like we built propaganda, in overwhelming volume, without concern for elegance or efficiency, prioritizing output over perfection. We couldn't match it. We never could. Whether Speer's account is entirely accurate, he had reasons to portray himself favorably in post-war testimony, the sentiment reflects a truth Hitler confronted privately as he maintained public delusion. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented everything Nazi ideology couldn't comprehend, that democracy could mobilize more effectively than dictatorship, that industrial capitalism could outproduce social state socialism, that a pluralistic society could coordinate better than totalitarian control. The final days of the Luftwaffe resembled a death spiral more than military operations. Fighters launched knowing they wouldn't return. Pilots flew without fuel for more than one sortie. Ground crews maintained aircraft with improvised parts because supply chains had collapsed. Airfields were captured or abandoned weekly as Allied armies advanced. By April 1945, organized Luftwaffe operations had essentially ceased. Feldwebel Heinz Knoch, who survived 400-plus missions and saw the Luftwaffe's complete collapse, wrote in his diary on April 20, 1945, Hitler's final birthday, "The sky is filled with American aircraft. They fly wherever they wish, whenever they wish, without opposition. Our fighters are grounded. No fuel, no ammunition, no purpose. The war is over. We simply haven't admitted it yet. The Americans won through production. They built more aircraft, trained more pilots, produced more ammunition than we could destroy. The Thunderbolts we laughed at in 1943 now fly overhead unchallenged." The laughter died with 20,000 German pilots. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the Luftwaffe officially ceased to exist. Allied intelligence teams fanned across occupied Germany, cataloging captured aircraft and interviewing surviving pilots. The transcripts reveal consistent themes: shock at American production capacity, respect bordering on fear for the P-47's capabilities, and recognition that the war's outcome was determined by industrial resources rather than tactical skill. One interrogation, conducted at the Ober-Ursel facility in June 1945, captured the transformation in German perception. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, who had 28 victories and survived the war, was asked to assess American fighter types. His response about the P-47: "In April 1943, we called them flying barns, enormous, clumsy, unsuited for air combat. We laughed. By June 1943, we stopped laughing. By September 1943, we feared them. By 1944, we knew they were unbeatable. Not because individual aircraft were superior, our late war fighters could match them in some performance parameters, but because there were hundreds of them. They absorbed damage that would destroy any German fighter. They carried ammunition for sustained engagement, while we had ammunition for brief bursts. Their pilots arrived with training we couldn't provide. Their production was unlimited while ours collapsed. The P-47 didn't just defeat the Luftwaffe, it buried it under industrial output we couldn't comprehend." The legacy of the P-47 extended beyond World War II. The aircraft's design philosophy, prioritizing survivability, firepower, and maintainability over performance optimization, influenced post-war American military aviation. The concept that industrial capacity mattered more than individual superiority became doctrine. American forces would never again enter conflict assuming technological elegance could overcome numerical advantage. The P-47 itself continued flying long after VE Day. Air National Guard units operated Thunderbolts through the early 1950s. Some served in the Korean War in ground attack roles. Foreign air forces, including those of Brazil, Mexico, and several South American nations, flew P-47s into the 1960s. The final operational Thunderbolt was retired in 1966, ending a 25-year service life. But the P-47's true impact wasn't measured in years of service or number of kills. It was measured in the psychological effect on an enemy who understood, too late, that they faced an opponent whose industrial capacity made defeat inevitable. German pilots who survived spoke of the Thunderbolt with a respect they rarely accorded other Allied fighters. The sound of those 8.50 caliber guns, Roosevelt's piano, haunted them for decades. At reunions of German and American fighter pilots held throughout the 1970s and 1980s, former enemies shared stories with mutual respect. But conversations about the P-47 revealed lingering trauma among Luftwaffe veterans. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, attending the 1982 reunion in San Antonio, was asked to assess American fighter types. His response about the P-47: "The Spitfire was beautiful. The P-38 was distinctive, the P-51 was elegant, but the P-47 was death. When you saw Thunderbolts, you knew someone wouldn't return. The sound of them diving, those massive propellers creating thunder you could hear from miles away, meant your comrades were about to die. We developed physical reactions, nausea, trembling, panic, just hearing that sound. Some pilots couldn't fly if Thunderbolts were reported in the area. The Americans called it a fighter. We called it a destroyer. It destroyed aircraft. It destroyed pilots. It destroyed the Luftwaffe. Hitler knew in 1943 that the war was lost when he understood what the P-47 represented. Not just an aircraft, an entire industrial system we couldn't defeat. The moment of Hitler's realization, November 26, 1943, in the Berghof conference room, represents a turning point in World War II that historians have often overlooked. The dramatic moments get remembered. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. But wars are decided by accumulated advantages that make defeat inevitable long before final battles are fought. Hitler's silent recognition that American industrial capacity made victory impossible was the moment for the European air war. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the weapon that forced that recognition. Ugly, heavy, seemingly unsuited for the elegant dogfighting German pilots mastered, it nonetheless destroyed the Luftwaffe through brute industrial logic. It proved that quantity and quality, combined with systematic production, created advantages that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. German pilots laughed at the P-47 in April 1943. By May 1943, there were no German pilots left to laugh. Between those dates, the thunder of American industrial might, manifested in 15,683 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, grew to a roar that drowned out everything else. The sky, once contested fiercely, belonged to America. The war, though it would grind on for another year and a half with horrific casualties, was decided. Hitler knew it. Goering knew it. Every Luftwaffe pilot who survived encounters with P-47s knew it. The thunder had spoken, and what it said was simple. The Reich was already defeated. Everything afterwards was merely the final calculation of mathematics playing out in blood and fire, until even Hitler couldn't deny what he'd realized 18 months before, that American industry had built a weapon Germany couldn't stop, and a future the Third Reich would never see. The legacy endures. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force, visitors can sit in a restored P-47D's cockpit. The instruments are clearly labeled, the visibility is excellent. The armor plate behind the seat is 3/8 inch thick, enough to stop 20mm cannon shells. The gun triggers, when pressed, would once have fired 100 rounds per second. The aircraft weighs 10,000 pounds empty, heavy enough that German pilots called it impossible. Yet it flew, and it dominated, and it won. Below the aircraft, a plaque bears a quote from Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, recorded in 1985, 4 decades after the war ended, but with memory still sharp. The P-47 destroyed the Luftwaffe, not through superior performance. We had fighters that could match it in specific parameters, but through systematic application of industrial resources we couldn't counter. America built thousands, we built hundreds. America trained pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. We sent novices with 30 hours. America had fuel for continuous operations. We scrounged fuel for individual missions. The disparity was overwhelming. When Hitler saw what the P-47 represented, he knew the war was lost. We all knew. We just couldn't admit it until the thunder stopped and silence filled the German sky. The silence came in May 1945. The thunder is remembered still. Final statistics that defined inevitability. Production, 15,683 P-47s built versus 54,000 total German fighters, all types, throughout the entire war. Pilot training. U.S. pilot training averaged 400 hours pre-combat. German training fell to 30 hours by 1945. Industrial capacity. U.S. produced 300,000 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced 119,000. Kill ratio. P-47 units achieved 4.6 to 1 against the Luftwaffe fighters. Survivability. P-47s had the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber despite ground attack missions. The conclusion. When Hitler saw the P-47 Thunderbolt through intelligence reports in November 1943, he realized Germany had already lost. The remaining 18 months proved him right. The Thunder spoke. The Reich fell silent.